to be here. We're thankful for Ron. We pray for him and Don as they deliver our lessons today, and we pray for safety through the weather today, and for those that we love and care about, pray that you'd watch over all of us. We pray that our time together would be well spent. We pray this in the name of Christ. Amen.
Okay, first of all, we want to make this, as Bill said, I'm sorry, as he said, as practical as possible. So feel free to interrupt me anytime you want to interrupt me, ask questions you want to ask. Please get into the discussion because we want this to be a very useful time. Chris was going to hand out, did you get it? Okay, A Child's World. Okay, here's the first question that we've got to remember. And this is not just true in regard to grief or loss, but it's true in regard to COVID, it's true in regard to school, it's true in regard to family situations. What is it that a child needs to survive?
Others.
I'm sorry, what?
Others.
Others. Okay, so you've got the little handout. So you're just going to fill out, they need others. Now, based upon their time and their mentality and whether they're mad or not, they may not feel like that they need others, but they need others. They truly need others to survive for their world to function as it needs to function. And so and again, we'll define who those others are in just a few moments. What else do they need?
They need guidance. Guidance.
Guidance. Yes, ma'am. Thank you. They need guidance. And by guidance, we're talking structure, we're talking help, we're talking encouragement, we're talking rules and regulations, parameters. We're talking things that will help keep them where they need to be, because even though, again, based upon who they are and their age group, they may think they know everything, but they don't. They don't. And that's why mom and dads are moms and dads. What else do they need?
Is support the same as guidance?
No, sir. Support. They need support. By support, we're talking about being there in both the good times as well as the bad times. Being there to say, okay, let me, you're making good decisions, let me support you in that. Or just the opposite. You're not making good decisions, so therefore we're going to support you in a different kind of way. But kids need support. They need backup. They need someone to be there for them. What else do they need?
They need to be heard.
Thank you, ma'am. They need to be, we'll put listened to. Yes. And if they're not listened, if kids don't get what they need from their moms and their dads and their grandparents and their peers and whatever, are their family members, who will they go to? They're going to go to their peers, to their own group, and those kids are going to listen to them, but what kind of parameters are they going to give them, if any?
Same stuff they're going to do.
Exactly. Well, this is what I did. Why don't you try this? So kids need to be listened to. What else?
They need to be told the truth.
That's a good one. In fact, I don't think I've ever been, I got to add that to my list. Given truth. Does truth hurt sometimes? Yes, it does. Will it be totally always appreciated? No, it will not. But they need to be known. They need to know this is the truth about this subject. These are the facts. These are the things that you need to know right here, right now. That's important for you to be able to function. We're talking about a child's world and whether they're able to function successfully, effectively, continually in regard to what they're dealing with. Now, you're saying, well, I thought this was dealing with grief. We're going to get there in just a minute. But I'm just trying to give you a perspective of what children need. What else? How about this one? Love. Now, what kind of love, Chris, does a child need in the midst of a grief situation of loss? What kind of love does a child need?
Understanding and unconditional.
Yeah, understanding, unconditional. You can ask us anything you want to ask us. You can describe anything you want to describe. You can, we're here because we love you unconditionally, period. Great to have Katrina here and her daughter. I forgot her name. Lauren. Like Lauren. Katrina and I go back to LA, South Alabama. She grew up there at the congregation where I preached for 12 and a half years. I don't know whether she remembers or not, but the last place that Bonnie and I and John Michael and Stephen lived was 475 Bruner Avenue, and which meant that we were a block and a half away from Magnolia Cemetery. I taught, our boys have talked about this, how many lessons of life they learned from living close to that cemetery. Because we would go over, now the rule of thumb was you don't ever go over there when there's a procession going on, when there's a funeral service going on. But afterwards, we'd ride our bikes or we'd go walking over there and we would talk about that person and that freshly dug grave and who those individuals were and how much we loved them and how much they loved us. And see, we were teaching lessons, and they talked about that. We were teaching lessons about love even in the midst of a situation like that. Well, that's exactly what a child needs. They need to know, and yes, did it elicit other questions? You bet. It really did. But we were all on the same wavelength because they knew that in the midst of everything else, Mom and Dad are going to tell us the truth. They're going to listen to us. They're going to support us. They're going to guide us. They're there to help us all through the idea of love. What else does a child need to function?
Physical touch, hug.
Wow, thank you. Let's just do affection, and that's exactly what we mean. Touch. Go back to the ministry of Jesus Christ and look at the number of times that Jesus touched someone. Touched the leper. The widow's son at Nain touched the funeral home. The bier, as I think it was called, which would made him unclean that day. But he didn't matter that he was unclean. He wanted that lady to know, I'm here to help. Children need affection. They need that in the midst of all that's going on, particularly as Don talked about in the first session here, if it's a sudden, unanticipated loss and we didn't see it coming, their minds are just going to be racing in regard to what does all this mean and what happened and what am I going to do and what does this mean for me? Anything else?
Well, in my profession, I've had them just to be able to ask questions, and then you tell them they want to, but they might ask why or why did this happen, to where they feel like they can ask things.
Exactly. The willingness to be able to for them to talk.
Which may be listened to, but.
Yeah. Part of that is you're going to listen to what they say, but the other part is you can say what you want to say.
An open dialogue.
There you go. Open dialogue. That's a great one. Let me go ahead and throw out attention, relationships, boundaries, safety, security, appreciation, patience. Here's one that's tremendously difficult in the midst of a grief loss. Normacy. Because everything is not normal. They need stability. They need examples to model. They need discipline. They need comfort. Well, I think the last time we spoke, or last year when we spoke somewhere, There were individuals there that were educational folks, supervisors, I think maybe even a superintendent. And the lady said, I'm going to take this information and use it for my teachers, because this is what a teacher needs to know as to their students today about everything, not just grief loss. And she's right. But because again, coming from a child's perspective, not from your perspective, from a child's perspective, what can we do about this? You have the handouts there in front of you. Number one, just realize we're not going to get through them. That's why I always give a lot more information than we'll have time to be able to do. And I'll probably need some time, because I don't usually look at my clock, my watch, whatever. But
how much time do you need? We got started a little late, so what?
I need about two and a half hours. So no, we can't have that much time. But anyway, the point of the matter is the reason you have all these notes is because they'll be able to help you later on in life. We're not going to go over, do you have the true and false? Is that the first thing that you have? Okay. You just pick out one that you want me to talk about. Let's just do it that way rather than going through each one of these. So, see, anything with the true and false that you say, okay, let's talk about that.
Number 7.
A lot of things have to be done based upon your children and you knowing who they are and what they can handle. At Cope Funeral Home in Evergreen, Alabama, the best solution in all the world to do was to take your family or your kids to the funeral home before there was ever any event at all, so they could see what that building was like. So they could see what the parlor was like, what the auditorium was like, so they could see what took place there. A second suggestion that I had and have received is take them to a visitation of someone that they have no emotional contact at all with. They're total strangers, but they are able to see for themselves what goes on at a situation. And you can stand back without any kind of disregard or disrespect and have them to ask questions. That's a real good way to sort of predetermine or get them into a relationship that possibly is, because something's going to come along. Then at the same time, you've got to ask yourself the question, what's the best thing for them at this point in time? Obviously, small children have no really concept. They just know that something's happened that's causing mom and dad and grandmom and granddad to be upset. And so therefore, you've got to ask yourself the question, is it, do we do this? Do we put them through this? Is it better to go to the visitation and not the funeral service? Is it better to go to the funeral service and not the visitation? You see the point. Just wherever the questions that because I think everyone, in my opinion, no one should be forced to do something like that, because if you force children that, what are the possible outcomes?
Big city.
Resentment, acting out, anger, bad behavior. I mean, all kinds of possibilities. But if you've given them, I know for during the time that we were in Evergreen, both Bonnie's parents, my wife's parents, died, and for our youngest son, we wanted him to be there with a family for visitation, but we arranged for him to be able to be there for just a little bit so that he would be able to be with his cousins and other family members and whatever. And then someone kindly took him to his house, for their house, for the remainder of the service. And that worked out extremely well. Our older son, Michael, he was just he just loved to meet with people anyway, so he was, he had no problem with it. But again, you just got to know what's best for your child. and I don't think there's a set rule of thumb, and we should not feel guilty. Please don't feel guilty that you make a decision for one versus the other. Were you going to say something, Kevin?
Yeah, and I don't know where you're going, so don't feel like.
I don't have the highest idea where I'm going.
Okay. Would be some, with your experience, some drawbacks of a child not going?
You mean, would it hurt them? I mean,
Yes. Is there any drawbacks to, to a child not attending a funeral or being involved in the funeral process?
well, I think what we can do when it comes to children is we can involve them in a funeral service in the sense of either if they want to read a scripture, if they want to read a poem, if they want to draw a picture and give it to either the remaining spouse or put it inside a casket, whatever. That's a contribution. Letting them sit with family members that would make them secure and feel safe and whatever. Drawbacks, we have cameras and we have phones, so we can take pictures if we need to take pictures of certain things that we might want to do to remind them later on. And just because they may not be at the actual service, if it's in a church building or if it's in the funeral home, does not mean that they can't be at the graveside. So because I think there are a lot of times a different situation there. So I don't see it hurting them very much in that regard. Again, based upon their situation. Again, think about it. Ask yourself, does my child understand what death means? Animals. We live in a world today where a lot of folks want to just keep people away from anything like that at all. I think that's a disservice in the sense of, growing up as a kid, as a preacher's kid particularly, we had funeral services for our animals. We really did. And when we had up there on the hill of the Holly House up on the hill in Evergreen, when one of those animals got killed or something other, we'd have a funeral service. Well, what were we doing? We were letting our kids know things that we love, and we want to honor that. So again, does that answer your question in regard to what you were asking?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Another one of the true and false.
10.
What?
Number 10.
Number 10. Yeah. Children really, as Don mentioned earlier in the first session, it's been, statistics show that a 6-month-old knows something's wrong in the family structure. Now, a 6-month-old cannot verbalize there's been a death in this family, but a 6-month-old child, statistics can show something's going on in the family unit. Something's going on here. Children will begin to realize after a couple of days or a couple of weeks or maybe just a couple of hours, someone here that I always loved is no longer here anymore. So what do you do with that? You remind them constantly, number one, hopefully that individual will always be loved right here. Remember E.T., the movie? And he's getting ready to finally leave after all the things he's gone through, and he tells the little boy, you will always be right here in my heart. And I don't know how many times I've used that, particularly for children, as I talk to them about their loved one. I said, as long as you have a heart and as long as you have a mind and you can see wonderful pictures, look at what that person, remember going fishing with them? Remember going riding the golf cart with them or whatever the case may be? Remind them. Children, and this is, go ahead and turn the page because you've got children in grief. You've got how children grieve. But the problem here is children have all the sadness, the fear, the anger, the other emotions. You don't have the vocabulary. Your limited exposure to life leaves you with little understanding of what's happening. You're aware that something has changed. You're not sure what has happened or why it's happened. You may assume you were to blame in some way for what happened, or you could have done something to have prevented it. It is amazing how so many individuals today, children, believe that they were the cause of, fill in the blank. Cause of a divorce, cause of a death, cause of a bad situation that happened at a house or at home or in the neighborhood, or particularly again, based upon the idiosyncrasies of your child, their own tendencies. Some of them are so tender-hearted that when anything around them happens that's bad, they look at themselves and say, what could I have done about this? Now, there are others that are just not as much that way. But the point of the matter is, when you come to grief and loss, you're dealing with an all-encompassing emotion that will affect them in so many different kinds of ways. I know we have some educators here. My wife retired from education a few years ago. COVID has been a curse and a half to any kind of learning ability for children because of all the disconnects. When you have a grief situation in the midst of all that, it becomes even more of a problem. Not only a headache, but a heartache. Because they realize that what used to be normal is abnormal now, and what used to be the way we did things, or the way we learned, or the way we sat in class, or thank you, Mel. You didn't put hot sauce in it this time. Thank you so much. Anyway, but all these, so we're moving uphill in a rough way these days, dealing with any kind of loss situation. And of course, as a lady told me one day, she said, when are you guys going to start doing COVID loss seminars? And I said, I don't know if I can even go there or not. I mean, we would never get finished because there's so many losses that COVID have caused these past couple of years. But for a child perspective, to be able to understand what's happening and why is it happening, and what does this mean to me? Those are just questions that have a lot of different answers to them. And what do you do about it? The best thing to do is to listen and look for teachable moments. I mentioned the cemetery where we live close by to in Evergreen, Alabama. We had all kinds of discussions. When a grave was dug, or while they were digging the grave, or the flowers upon that. The rainbow. That's a teachable moment. Having someone that's no longer there, having someone cry. Why are they crying? Let's talk about that. Children, here's the good news. Children are much more resilient when it comes to grief loss than we are. Children grieve much more effectively than we do. Why is that the case?
Innocence, maybe.
Innocence? What else? Let me use this illustration.
It'll flip if you pull that thing at the bottom.
Okay. That's a box and that's a box. That's a grief box and that's a grief box. Which one's a kid's grief box? That one. Children can only grieve so much. And after that, when their grief box is full, they're finished at that point in time. We wallow in our grief box. We do it 24/7. We want to get up in the morning and we want to talk about it and we want to go to bed with it and we want to wallow in it, and kids Can't do that. Don had a terrible situation of a church where he was preaching up in Florence. The mother died suddenly of a situation. Don said there was a 10-year-old boy that was there in the funeral situation, and he was wailing. He said, I had never heard a child wail before. He said that child was uncontrollably wailing. And he said, then we said, this was one of the country congregations, he said, then we dismissed, finished the service, and we walked across the street. In 15 minutes, we were across the road at the country cemetery. He said, I looked, and there's that same 10-year-old boy kicking rocks, chasing and playing with his cousins. And I said, what in the world happened to this child? It was full. He could not do anything else. He was finished at that point in time. So therefore, he was able to get back to, and children do that. They are much more resilient when it comes to grief loss than we are. And that's the good news. And so therefore, I think the notes, how children grieve, children experience, they want to play and act out, they'll hit and run, they'll set the time, they use questions, they deal with grief throughout the childhood. They will ask the questions when you're not ready for them, but that's okay. They will want to know, and this is why we need to be extremely careful in regard to listening to their question. They will want to know when they ask a question about a grief loss, likely just one thing. Don't give them 10 things. Does that make sense? If they're asking, where are they now? You don't have to go into a theological discussion of paradise and heaven and hell. And you don't have to do that. You just say, they're no longer here, but they're always with us. And then talk about that. Go back to affection. Go back to touching. Go back to open dialogue. Go back to giving the truth. Go back to support. You see the point? So remember that. And again, it's easy to get, because a lot of times when I talk with parents and others about grief, they said, but I just feel so unprepared for their questions. Well, there's a reason, likely, why they ask that question. They saw something they read, something they heard. They had a discussion with one of their peers. They had a discussion with one of their cousins. They just are dealing with that. So, do you have the next one? How to help your child understand death? Okay, look at some of the things here. In fact, okay, I'll just let you point a number. You give me a number, let's talk about it.
Which one are you on?
How to help your child understand death. Y'all have that one?
Yeah.
Okay. Someone give me a number.
Number 1, animals.
Yeah, animals and plants. I mean, maybe it's just preachers' kids, but we had funerals for fish, our pet fish. And then after we had the funeral, we flushed it down the toilet. Cats, dogs, whatever the case may be. But we taught them, it's not made to live forever. And then you can take, if you get a child to understand that concept in regard to animals and plants and whatever, then later on, as they mature, you can say, but you know what? God put something in us that does live forever. You see the way you segue into that discussion? And that's an extremely important one for them to remember as time to come. Another one. 15. Wow, thank you. People say, unfortunately, the things that they hear other people say without even thinking about them. Biblically speaking, the Bible tells us that God, Acts chapter 17, that God does not need anything from us. That's why He created the world, and we didn't have anything to do with it. And so therefore, when we start implying that God needed them in heaven, God needed another little child up in the choir, up in it. Wow, are you messing with some? Are you beginning to give them some false ideas about God and about how death occurs and about what happens in the afterlife? Be extremely careful about what you say about how God does this or God did that, because I don't know if we can understand all those things. Yes, there are some terrible events that happen, accidents and other such things I cannot explain. I'm grateful that God understands. And He'll make it all right at the end. Just be extremely careful how you say things.
What about it was God's will?
Thank you, ma'am. Isaiah 55, 8 and 9 says that God's ways are not our ways, His thoughts are greater than our thoughts. I really believe, this is my personal opinion, that we as finite individuals cannot understand the infinite, almighty will of God. And therefore, for me to say, this must have been God's will that this would happen, I don't think I can say that. And therefore, in fact, I think it's just the opposite. When something terrible happens, God's the first one to cry. When 9/11 happened, almost 20 plus years ago, He was the first one to cry. He didn't cause that. The devil and those who follow the devil caused that. And so when terrible things happen, we want to say, well, it was God's will. Last time I checked, you're not the creator. You're still the created. And you have a skewed, finite mind approach to understanding why terrible things happen to good people as well as bad people. So again, be extremely careful what you want to say there. We've got two theologians in the back. They can now exegete that particular statement anytime y'all want to. Yes, sir.
A question regarding that. I've heard family members of the one who passed say that. They've said, well, I guess God needed him, and it's like they're, and I don't want to use the word hung up on that, but and I think you're correct. People repeat something that they hear.
Right.
How do you, or how have you, in kind of the prefaces, besides not acknowledging that, what's the best way when somebody passes and like their spouse or their children say, well, I guess God needed him? I've typically just kind of let that statement ride.
I would let the statement lie, and then in a few days, I'd go visit them in their home, when we'd have a discussion, and say, let's talk about that for a few moments, if you don't mind. And reassured them that God did not need them to. There's a difference between God needing something and God allowing something. And that's what we've got to remember. And it's hard for a child to understand that, but it's also hard for a lot of adults to understand that. And so therefore, we've got to be sure that we show them the difference between, Job's a classic book. God said, Satan, you do what you want to, but you can't kill him. Because he said, I know that, he knew something that Satan didn't know. I know how it's going to turn out. And see, that's the whole point. God knows how things are going to turn out. We don't. And therefore, we've got to be careful in that regard by assuming that we do. Because, there are some folks that can really wax elephants on this. They get really upset. Oh, I do know what God's will was. Well, I don't know if you do or not. Not when it comes to finite situations of things that are going to end, or that are, a person's life taken from them. That's not God's will. Someone took free moral agency and violated kindness and love by doing something like that.
And the dangerous.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Kevin. Go ahead.
The dangerous thing, as we're dealing with children, is their impression of God could be influenced for their entire life.
Exactly.
When you say, well, God wanted them,
Exactly.
or this was God's will.
Exactly.
And that's going to make that child sit back and say, what do you mean that was what God wanted?
Well, the simple idea of of telling the child, well, it looks like granddaddy's asleep. Uh-oh. If that's what happened when I go to sleep, I don't want to sleep anymore.
Yeah.
See the point? I mean, what you're saying is, by just something that simple that's misunderstood or misquoted or misconstrued can lead to a lot of other terrible situations as well. Which is why we talk with them. Again, look for teachable moments. Always look for teachable moments. Okay, someone had this bell.
I had a question. This happened years ago when my son was 10, but our friend lost their child to cancer who was the same age. And his question, which was really hard for me, was, well, why does God let children die?
Right.
And I don't know if we did it right, but what would you say?
Well, I guess I would say, obviously, in the sense of a child dying because of a cancer situation, they didn't die because God wasn't caring for that child. They died because they had a sickness that could not find a cure for it. But let me tell you what God does with little children when they die. Then I would begin to paint this picture of the wonderful love of God and what God does when we leave this world. And I would always remind them, we may not be able to see Johnny right now, but guess where he is? And guess what God's doing? And I said, we want to be with Johnny when this life is over. Again, I look for every opportunity I can to bring them back here. Bring them back to where God is. And I do that regardless of whether it's young or old or light. Okay. Time's about up, isn't it?
It's 11:34. We got started late. If you want to go a little while longer, we'll.
Well, you got the outline. And that's why you've got it. So please feel free to look at it these next couple of hours when we have a break. Come back to them. We'll be glad to talk about this again. Let me just continue to remind you. Look at your child, understand it from their perspective. Put on their glasses, not your glasses, and sit with them and let them know we're in this together. You hurt, I hurt, we all hurt because of love plus loss equals grief. Anything you ask, we're here for you. You folks did a great job with this. Thank you. Chris, go ahead.
One more question before we close.
Sure.
And I can pick your brain later if need be.
They're still going there.
They're still going? All right. This whole grief box thing has my head in a whole different place right now.
Okay.
When a child's grief box is full, and like I was looking down this list, like at number 16 on your list, don't try to stop the grieving process with children. How do we as adults, I'm very hard-headed and stubborn, and my brain doesn't function right.
Amen.
So, yeah, we'll see about that. So, how do I as an adult, when my child's grief box, my children are older now, but when their grief box is full and they start to kind of get stuff out of that box, I'm a very let's move on kind of guy.
Right.
And that's the way I've handled grief for years even, so it's hard for me to understand. How can adults help that child or help maybe us understand their grief box is smaller than ours? Does that make any sense?
Yes.
Like I'm struggling with this in my
Excellent
head right
question. You will know that a child's grief box is when they return, when they ask the question, you deal with the discussion, and then they say, okay, where's my Game Gear? Where's my where's this? They move back to their own life, whatever it is.
And you talking 10 and under?
Yeah, probably. But there are also some very mature 9-year-olds, and there are also some very immature 12-year-olds.
Okay.
See the difference?
Right.
So again, you've got to look at the child, not so much the age. And also ask the question, when's the last time they dealt with grief loss? What relationship did it have to them? How did it affect them? What did they do about it? I mean, there's all kinds of questions to ask. Sort of a list of things You get the idea this is sort of difficult to deal with, because it is. But yet, when a child's grief box will be based upon their own emotions, their own feelings, their own frustrations, their own understandings, mom and dad, what mom and dad and others around them have done for them. I mean, all kinds of things will affect how that gets handled. I ask open-ended questions, always. And then I take the time to listen to their answers to figure out where they are with their grief box. Because, for days, in a grief situation, for days, a child may totally avoid the subject because they're still processing what all this means. Then they're going to hit you with it, and you're saying, whoa, where'd that come from? Well, that's when their grief box needs to be dealt with. And that's when I start asking open-ended questions for them. And try to, and just let them know, whatever you say is fine. And see, here's another thing. Every one of your children are going to grieve differently because they're made differently. They act differently. And so we gotta remember that as well. And Chris is right. Unfortunately, what usually happens is a child they make a statement about grief, and we either, number one, are not ready for it, or secondly, we're in a hurry doing other 20 things that we need to be dealing with, and we don't give them any validation of that. We don't give them any discussion. We'll just talk about that later on. If you say that too often, what's going to eventually happen?
Later on, never come.
They will shut you down. Later on will never come. Exactly.
I also think when children experience a loss, as they develop and go through different stages, that loss comes back and they process it again
Exactly.
at a different
At yes. Grief loss will change as they change in life. And it will become either more of a part of them or less a part of them based upon the situation itself. So yes, that's exactly true. And just because they deal with it at 3